So there's not much new to talk about this week with TV or movies. So I wanted to get into some book talk. I hope that's okay. I mean, am I going to be turning a lot of people off with book talk? I don't know, but when I did the top 10 wizards, it seemed like there was a lot of overlap on the folks that are watching my comic book videos and folks that also like fantasy novels. I mean, I certainly like both. In fact, I love fantasy novels as much as comic books and, the occasional sci-fi, but I'm probably a little bit more of a fantasy guy. I also like some horror novels here and there. But many things go in phases. And with me, sometimes I'll go through a phase where I prefer books to comic books, fantasy books, sci-fi books, and sometimes I prefer comic books to the prose stuff. So it just kind of comes and goes, waxes and wanes. Pun intended if you're a Brandon Sanderson fan. But I do always seem to have a fantasy novel that I'm either reading or rereading. That light seemed a little harsh, so I kind of turned it down a bit. Hold on. I'm still catching some glare from sunshine, so there's not much I can do about the sunshine. Sorry, guys. But like I said, I've almost always got a fantasy novel that I'm either reading or rereading. Actually, I'm almost 100% audiobooks now. So I know some people might not consider that as counting as reading, and I get it because you're not reading, you're listening. But I'm still consuming the novels in my own way. So make of it what you will. I just want to be truthful with everybody. I don't want to try to paint myself as doing something a little bit different than what I'm actually doing. But I love to put on my headphones, listen to an audiobook for an hour, hour and a half every night before I go to sleep. Helps me wind down, helps me go to sleep. And of course, I used to do a lot of actual eyeball reading, and that was great too. But it's like I got hooked on the auditory feedback, and now I love that. But I just want to talk a little bit about a fantasy subgenre, or it might even be a subgenre, that I didn't even know about until maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I'm thinking closer to 4 probably, and now I think it might be my favorite. It's called Flintlock Fantasy, and it's definitely fantasy, so it's a subgenre of fantasy for sure. But then it's also, at least what I've read, it's epic fantasy. So it's like a subgenre. It's Flintlock Fantasy, falls under epic fantasy, falls under fantasy. And then there's almost always a really heavy military fantasy component. So I don't know, you can keep chopping that down, subgenre. I'm a lumper, not a splitter, so I just call it Flintlock Fantasy and hope that I'm not using the term incorrectly. Hopefully you understand what I'm talking about. So, what exactly is Flintlock Fantasy? Now, I'm not by any means the authority that gives the definitive definition. That was redundantly redundant, but I'm just going to tell you what I think it is. I don't know if there's like an official council of elders that passes down like the rule of what something needs to get the stamp of approval as Flintlock Fantasy, but I'm going to try to tell you what it means to me. It's a fantasy story with a magic system and supernatural elements, just like any other kind of epic fantasy. But it also involves gunpowder, guns. And it's not just any guns, like, urban fantasy has lots of modern guns. But it's sort of early guns. I think, for me at least, it's probably like Napoleonic era guns. More than anything else. It doesn't have to strictly be that, but that gives you the idea. I'm not a gun expert. I don't know the difference in a flintlock versus a matchlock versus something that uses a cap or whatever. I've tried to ask some folks that know more about it, and it's, they're speaking a different language to me sometimes. So early guns is what I say. Primarily like Napoleonic era guns. And also cannons and a few bombs, early style black powder, gunpowder bombs, that kind of thing. And at least in my mind, my kind of default assumption about Flintlock Fantasy is that there's going to be a heavy military component to it. So that's where the military fantasy comes in with the epic fantasy and then simply fantasy. And yes, I will double down here and say that like the ideal, the stereotypical image that I have in my mind of Flintlock Fantasy is 100% set in the Napoleonic era. Very similar to the era of the Napoleonic Wars, not just in Europe, but also in Egypt, and even in North America, like right around that War of 1812 kind of thing that was going on, maybe even go a little earlier, French and Indian War time frame. That to me is kind of the sweet spot setting for Flintlock Fantasy. And I think the reason that that's so firmly set in my mind as the typical setting for Flintlock Fantasy is two of the best examples, two of the first books in this sub genre that I read were set firmly in that era. They're very much set in what I will call Napoleonic analogs. I bought my first Flintlock Fantasy novel, which was an audiobook, like I said before, by mistake, honestly. What I was really looking for at the time was something similar to Game of Thrones, to the Song of Ice and Fire. And I got something with these countries at war with each other with rifles, or at least muskets and cannons, and I was really kind of confused at first. There were bayonet charges, stuff that, I didn't expect in my typical medieval fantasy. And I don't know why I didn't think I'd like it, but I was just so tuned in to the sword and sorcery medieval European setting that it took me a minute to get outside my comfort zone. But I love history, and I love magic. So it should have been a no-brainer that this would be like a perfect combination for me. Because it's such a wonderful mashup of those two things, magic and history, pseudo-history. Like the fun part of history isn't always the accurate depiction of it, but the legends that built up around it, at least for me. I'm not certain what the first Flintlock Fantasy was, but the first one that I read was the Powder Mage series by Brian McClellan. The first book is called A Promise of Blood, and I picked it up thinking it was going to be like political intrigue along the lines of Game of Thrones, and it was political intrigue, just a different setting, different level of industry and technology in the story, and I loved it. I went ahead and read the other two books in that trilogy, then there was a follow-up trilogy. I read those. I absolutely love this series. But the first book was published in 2013 in this Powder Mage series. The Powder Mages actually consume gunpowder, or maybe it's black powder. Once again, I don't necessarily know the difference in those things, but we'll call it gunpowder just to shorten, so I'm not qualifying everything I say. But the Powder Mages actually eat this, consume this gunpowder, and it gives them superpowers. They get enhanced senses, enhanced speed, enhanced strength and reflexes. They really become these fighting machines. They can also use their power to push musket balls or bullets or whatever the case may be. It's pretty cool. And some powder mages are better at one aspect. Some powder mages are better at the other. There's one guy that his sort of nickname is Touche. So the memory card in my audio recorder died at this point. So I have to apologize. But the rest of this video doesn't have my typical audio quality. Not that bad. But just warning you, you could listen and see behind the curtain what it sounds like before I do my audio stuff versus after. All right, enjoy at your own risk. Musket or rifle or whatever with two musket balls instead of one, and the gunpowder fires one, and he uses his powder mage powers to fire the other, and that makes him legendary and extraordinarily deadly in a time where everybody had one shot at their fingertips, I guess. And another cool thing is that in this storyline, the gunpowder can be sort of addictive. And if people use too much, they can experience a condition called being powder blind or burned out, and it's pretty cool. It's got a nice, delicate balance. Brian McClellan went to study creative writing at University of Utah, I believe, and Brandon Sanderson was one of his professors there, and it kind of shows because he really understands the hard magic system and the fact that the limitations of magic are more interesting than the powers, which is like Brandon Sanderson's first rule of magic, if you're familiar with that. But it has a great father-son story in it, and it's a real good story about a democratic revolution that's met with hostility from the bordering countries' monarchies. Has a real French Revolution feel to it there. I bought copies for my father. I got the first three for him as a Father's Day gift, and I think the second three as a birthday gift. He really liked them, so that's also a cool aspect. It's something, I can enjoy along with my dad, reading it and talking about it. The next series I read in the genre was probably Brent Weeks' Lightbringer series, and it's really quite different. In fact, it's so different it didn't click with me at first that this probably counts as Flintlock Fantasy. Mainly because the magic system involves light and the light spectrum specifically, so people can have this ability to do things with certain colors of light in the spectrum. And honestly, it gave me more of a Green Lantern feel than anything, except it's set like in the early 17th, maybe late 16th century equivalent in their level of technology. I mean, all these things are epic fantasy, so they're not on Earth, they're in another place, a fantasy world, but that's the historical frame of reference for the guns that they have. But just like in the Green Lantern comic books, you know, you have the Green Lanterns, the Yellow Lanterns, Blue Lanterns, Indigo Tribe, Red Lanterns, all that kind of thing. Well, in this story, there are some people that can use green light, and green light has a power that's different than yellow light, that has a different power from all those others. But then they also have people that can use more than one wavelength in the spectrum. Usually they're adjacent, like red and yellow, just to throw that out there. I don't remember my Roy G. Biv as well as I should, but you get the idea. And then rarely there are these people that can use every color in the spectrum. They're called prisms. The first book is called The Black Prism as a reference to that. So it's pretty cool. Django Wexler's Shadow Campaign series was the next thing I read. This is the series that most closely sticks to the Napoleonic Wars analog. There's a character that's very, very clearly based on Napoleon in this book. The first book is basically parallel to Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, but their magic system is really cool because in this magic system, there are these entities. Some people call them demons, some people call them something else, but they're these entities, and if you discover their name and you read their name aloud or say their name aloud, that individual that does that bonds with this specific entity, and they're given a specific power set that matches that entity. And my understanding is no two of those demons, which there are like 1,000 of them out there, no two of them have exactly the same power. Kind of reminds me a little bit of like in the Stormlight archives when a Knight Radiant bonds with the Spren, something like that, only their powers are a little more narrowly defined in the Django Wexler series. But man, I love this series too. You can't go wrong with that one. It's really fun. I think if you're interested in checking out Flintlock Fantasy, that might be an awesome place to start, because I think that's going to be, at least the template that's built in my mind, that might be the default, like the dictionary definition of Flintlock Fantasy is probably that story, and it's so good. There's also Brandon Sanderson's second Mistborn series, like not the actual Mistborn series, but what I think most people call the Wax and Wane series. It takes place 300 years later. There's guns in there, powder, gunpowder type guns, more primitive guns. But I would say that the setting there is a lot more like the Old West and cowboys than it is the Napoleonic stuff. So we're looking at, roughly, let's say, 70 years later, just to set a general time frame out there. And it's kind of like this guy from the city. And once again, this is Scadrial. It's not Earth, so all the cities have different names. But just imagine a guy from New York City goes out west to become a bounty hunter or a cowboy. After spending 20 years out there, he comes back to New York and he brings that mentality and that life experience with him back to the big city. And then he faces threats to justice, I guess you would say, in that city, along with one of his partners he met out west. And it's real cool. It's like a cowboy come to the city kind of story with magic. If you're familiar with allomancers and ferochemists from the Mistborn series, that's the kind of magic system. I mean, it's the exact same magic system. And then there's another series that I only read the first book. I think the first book's called Temeraire. Maybe I'm not pronouncing that correctly. But this is alternate history. This is historical fiction, historical fantasy. And what I mean by that is it's not set on another world in a situation similar to the Napoleonic Wars. It is set in Britain during the Napoleonic Wars, where they're actually at war with Napoleon. All the countries involved in the war have air forces, and those air forces are dragons. Like the aviators are actually people that ride the dragons. So, I mean, it's cool. It sounded really cool, but it just wasn't for me. If you like it, that's awesome. I'm happy for you, but it's just not quite what I was looking for. No wizards in it, just the dragons. So do you have any other like sci-fi fantasy recommendations for me to look into? Do you know about some Flintlock Fantasy stories or series that I'm not aware of or that I didn't mention? Please let me know down in the comments. Also, let me know if there's any other like fantasy or sci-fi books, genres, series, anything like that you'd like me to talk about. Or if you just hate books altogether, let me know and I'll stay away from this. But thanks for giving me a little bit of your time. Any general comments about the channel as a whole, let me know, because I would like to do some feedback videos occasionally. So I need a little feedback to do those. So thank you for that. That's all I've got for now. I hope that's okay. Talk to you later.